Good evening, everybody, and welcome to 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. Fergal, James, thank you both so much for joining us here this evening. To our guests on the call here this evening, we've got Fergal McCarthy, the visual artist and teacher who we've actually just seen in that lovely little trailer that we were watching while we were waiting for our session to begin, which is depicting a project you'll hopefully tell us a bit more about later on this evening. So Fergal, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Very, very happily. And our second guest this evening is a board member here in the Little Museum and a celebrated writer and educator through the School of Creative Writing in UCD, James Ryan. So James, thank you also.
Thank you very much indeed. And hi, Fergal.
How are you doing?
Not so bad.
Brilliant. So to everyone on the call, obviously, if you have questions for Fergal or James throughout the evening, please type them in and we will get through a few of them as the session goes through. But I'm going to jump in and ask a question and just make a start for it. James, I'm going to come to you first. James, you were responsible for being the founding director of the creative writing course out in UCD. And I guess I'd love to just start by asking you about that programme and how it came about.
Well, I think the universities over the years, or decades rather, have been moving closer to offering creative writing as part of their courses. There was a lot of resistance to it, obviously, down the years, because the universities were seen as sort of just academies of research and so forth. But the American and British experiences had taught us in Ireland here that this is something for which there's a great deal of demand, and students wanted to have the option, not necessarily to do all creative work in university, but at least to have the option to experience it, and that's where it began. There were always writers, well, not always, but for a long time, there were writers in residence in universities. And that really expanded into offering maybe more, I say, sort of credit-based courses. I certainly had worked in NUI Galway for 2 years before coming to UCD, and then the creative writing program was kicked off on a fairly modest scale first in 2005-06.
Okay, and so James, where did your own interest in creative writing come from? Like, what was your own motivation?
Oh, very, very difficult. I hope you asked Fergal that question too. Very, very difficult to pin that down. I think that most people who write are people who have been telling themselves stories for years. It's a way of encountering or understanding the world. From a very young age, you actually create narrative around all kinds of experience, minor and major, and you kind of string them together. It's a way of, as I say, encountering the world. And then at some stage, you begin, I think, to kind of maybe formalize it a bit. It's not a difference in kind in terms of activity, but a difference in degree. You take it more seriously and more formally, and you start to frame those narratives into whatever way you like: short stories, flash fiction, lots of poetry. Doesn't really matter.
Fergal, I'm going to ask you the same question in terms of where your own inspiration came from originally.
Well, I was always a maker and a doer, always. And I guess I grew up in the 70s when parents had a very hands-off attitude towards child rearing. And my parents never really pushed me in any direction or told me to do anything. And now I'm a parent myself, and it's a constant roster of after-school activities and football and hurling and all of that, whereas I was so left to my own devices. So I had no option but to entertain myself. So I was always making things. But in school, I almost had no arts education whatsoever. I never studied art in primary school or in secondary school. And I studied French in college and teacher training. So I've never studied art in any shape or form. whether that is a good or a bad thing remains to be answered. But so it's all, I'm very much an autodidact, and so it's come from God knows where. My dad was very good with his hands, but never really taught me how to do anything. And I would look on jealously and wonder if I could someday learn how to, build things like he did, which I've somehow managed to do.
There's a lovely sense of curiosity there, ultimately, is what I'm hearing. And so I guess, Fergal, I'd love you to actually tell those of us who are on the call this evening a little bit about your own style as a visual artist and kind of the types of mediums that you work in.
Yeah, I guess I've tried everything, and I've got a very short attention span. And as soon as I get good at one thing like painting, I completely give it up and I try something else like sculpture or filmmaking or maybe performance art. And I think visual art can be a very difficult medium, and it comes with an awful lot of baggage, and it can be very off-putting to an awful lot of people. And I guess that's what I liked about working with the little museum, in that your attitude was very democratic, and you try to divest subjects of their baggage and make it as attractive and fun and interesting. And that's when I worked with you and Simon and Trevor, that was always the thrust, was how do we make this fun and engaging and try to bring in as many people as possible. And that was the starting point. Whereas in the visual art world, it can be the opposite. It can be for the 1%. And it can be for the collectors with gold cards and private jets. And I'm not interested in that side of the art world, really. And they're not interested in me, unfortunately.
Fair. It's yeah, I think, as you said, I think accessibility of the kind of the way that we put forward information in the museum is really quite a huge priority, and something that actually, James, you've been really kind of instrumental in helping us to develop over the last couple of years through your role in the board. But Fergal, you lead me on very nicely to ask you. So we first worked together in 2014 when you created an exhibition on the Battle of Clontarf for us. A lot of the guests with us now this evening are participants and members and kind of friends of the museum over the last number of years, so some of them might remember it themselves. But could you tell us a little bit about the exhibition and how you approached it?
Well, because I'm also a primary school teacher, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I draw on the whiteboard. That's how I teach. So generations of children have been subjected to my silly little drawings, and I try to turn everything into a cartoon. And I'm not that funny in real life, but in a drawing, I got a little bit more time to think about it. And and that's how I've taught subjects like science or history or geography, which aren't always. The textbooks in Ireland are terrible in relation to these things, and they don't bring a lightness of touch to them, and they're heavy on text and not enough visual stimulation. And I guess when you guys asked me, I immediately started to think about wallpapering the space in these giant drawings, and to make the exhibition big and engaging and fun and a little bit rude on occasion. And we got such a great reaction. And Simon and Trevor and yourself pushed me to always think of something else. Like I hadn't thought about a soundtrack. So, I remember the three of you said, when you walk into the room, you've got these beautiful, interesting drawings, but there's nothing going on. How do we hourly interest the viewers? So I got a school of kids in Iceland who I found out that the Vikings spoke a language which is very similar to current Icelandic. So I accessed a school in Iceland, and I got them to put on a little play battle in the schoolyard. And we recorded the sounds of these kids fighting. And then I did the same thing in a Gaelscoil in Clondalkin, where I teach myself, because the Irish at the time, of course, spoke Irish. So then we made a soundscape of arrows and axes and kids roaring out. And that was, so it was a great collaboration. And quite often you're left to your own devices as an artist, but which sometimes can be a good thing. But in this case, I loved working with people who often had better ideas than I had myself, like the three of you.
Well, that's very sweet. And I think one of my one of the standout memories that I have of that exhibition is walking into the room one day, and there was a young boy who must have been maybe 9, sitting on the ground, cross-legged, staring at the walls, reading the kind of each of the comic book stills within it. And I came back in 10 minutes later and he was still there. And that was the moment where I kind of went, right, this has been a lovely success. And I think kind of that whole take on creative writing and a creative outlet and a way of telling a story is really, it's something you do very beautifully, and it was something that we were very, very proud to display in the museum. And I think this idea of writing creatively, James, that's obviously something that's true to your own heart as well. Could I ask you to maybe unpack for me what it is to write creatively as opposed to?
Okay, well, yeah, first of all, I don't think I have a complete or absolute answer for that, Sarah, except to say that traditionally the division was between, say, academic writing and creative writing. You know, you had the scholar on one side and you had the novelist or poet on the other. And they were in very different spaces. That's not the case so much now. Indeed, they're bringing astrophysics into the equation these days. I think writing creatively for many people is any kind of writing to start with. Any symbol you put down on a page or type onto your screen, anything you do, any squiggle you make, any whatever else. Well, I mean, that technically is an act of a small act of creation. It may have no significance whatsoever, but it's an attempt to do something which is using a creative or imaginative element of your thinking. Now, that's one extreme. The other extreme, I think, is perhaps a too rigid a view of creative writing, that something has to be a novel, or it has to be a poem, or it has to be, you know, in a particular packaged format. I think that's a very disencouraging attitude. Actually, Sarah, I better tell people that you were one of my students on one of the courses, the modules, not the postgraduate courses. But you might remember that we didn't attempt to write short stories or poems or anything like that. We just did small narrative pieces or exercises. The most we would have got to was something like maybe a piece of flash fiction or whatever else. So I think creative writing has to be given a very broad understanding to make it encouraging for people, particularly people in education, to embark on it.
As you alluded to there, James, yes, I had the luxury of knowing you as a teacher before I knew you as a board member and kind of, I guess, supporter through the museum back when I was doing my undergraduate a number of years ago. But
last year, was it, Sarah?
Last year, yes. Something like that. And I think when you're talking about this whole idea of creativity in education, you know, is the value of creativity, do you feel like, and actually this is Fergal, a question I'd have for yourself as well, in obviously a university versus a primary school setting, is the value of creativity perceived in education, do you believe?
So for me?
Perfect, yes.
Oh yeah. Well, decidedly, if the value, there has been more and more value put on creativity in education from the very early days, even just say the last 50 years of, you know, rote learning, reproduction of just information, and that's what the student got credit for. Yeah, it is much more creative now, and if you get somebody like Fergal as your teacher, you're way out there in terms of good fortune for appealing to your creative and imaginative side. I mean, kids, as I'm sure Fergal will agree, the younger, are unbelievably imaginative, and we really have a tradition of, as it were, knocking that out of them to mainstream them for very convergent thinking, which traditionally the exam system has dictated. So my own area of research early on, I mean, this is a long time ago now, was in asking established visual artists to consider how their primary and secondary education, if they had a secondary education, had contributed to the development of their creative talent. And I had a great, 10 fairly major people, and you know, very little. It was always down to one person in the system, one teacher, a parent, somebody who kept that imaginative spark going. And that became, for many of them, a kind of lifeline. One person, one influential person, or even a friend who was kind of supportive of the project.
And Fergal, I wonder from a primary school education point of view, if you have any kind of opinions about how the value of creativity is seen in the classroom.
Well, I'd have to agree with James. I think the system knocks our creativity out of us, and it's still very much geared towards memory. And if you've got a good memory, you can become a vet regardless of your ability with animals. And that's the only skill, from my perspective, that I see as being tested. And I think that's a terrible thing that it hasn't changed. I did the Leaving Cert, I think, about 30 years ago. And it seems to have changed so little. Like nothing in life will be like that ever again. You will never be expected to regurgitate 5 or 6 years of learning over the course of a fortnight. It should be all, from my perspective, project-based. You do projects and you sink or swim, and it shouldn't be based on success. You learn so much by failing. You know, it's that Beckett quote, you know, fail again, fail better. Is that Beckett, I think? And that's how you learn to do things, by you know, there's too much focus on perfection and an A. And like I got a D in the Leaving Cert in English. And I thought very poor teachers in English, and I hadn't written an essay for 2 years between my intercert, as it was called then, and my Leaving Cert. And I didn't know how to write an essay anymore. And in the meantime, I've written for The Guardian, and I've written for the Irish Times, and I've made a book with you guys. And I'm not saying I'm going to be winning the Booker Prize anytime soon, but I'm able to write somewhat. But this was never helped by my education in secondary school. And I think, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think education in Ireland is, and in many countries, really has an awful, you know, we could do so much more. Yeah.
Right. And actually, kind of on that sentiment, the Battle of Clontarf exhibition that you produced and made with us in the museum, I remember that a key element that you were very kind of upfront about from the beginning that you thought was important was having an interactive children's element where they got to push their own work up on the walls within the museum. You know, would you talk me through, first of all, what happened, and then what the thinking behind it was?
Well, I guess I spent a long time in my life, not so much now, but for about 20 years, I traveled around the world, constantly going to museums and art galleries. And almost none of them would even have a bench or a chair where you could sit. And that's interaction, just sitting in this beautiful room, like these beautiful palaces and museums. And yeah, they're so unpeople friendly quite often. And that's changing radically. So I've always loved museums like your own that make an effort to make the visitor experience as engaging and welcoming, and taking away all those barriers that are put up. So it's not this august institution, it's thank you so much for coming. Use this space, it's yours for 5 minutes. Go to sleep in the corner if you have to, you know, because your tax is paying for it. You know, it's not for this rarefied art class of, and yeah, so I mean, for that first exhibition, we had one wall left over where anybody who visited could draw their own interpretation of the story, and we put them up, and I think thousands of them got made. And it kept the people in the space for longer as well. And that's a very healthy thing, especially I think with children, to start that tradition of spending time in museums and galleries, because you can learn so much from them. and you're learning it for yourself. You know, it's not a teacher telling you, it's you taking the information that you like from the walls. But it's so important that you're welcomed into your space. Like, I know that you guys make a point of, you walk in the door and immediately you get this great welcome at that desk. And that doesn't happen. I could mention major museums and galleries in the city that look up disgusted at the idea that they're being interrupted from checking their Facebook. Yeah.
Okay, it's yeah, I guess the hospitality and the kind of the warm welcome is something that really, yeah, it's really very important to us. Like we've been discussing the kind of the future of the museum and the vision for the museum with the board over the last couple of months, and this kind of idea of almost a community centre is a kind of a sentiment that has come across quite a number of times. And so it's if that feel is actually received for the guest coming into the building, then that's all the better. It really is everything we aspire to do. So it's lovely to hear you say that. So thank you. It's now, James, you are the author of 4 novels, and you know, one thing I'd be just curious about is, how do you actually go about developing the concept for a piece of writing? And I say this as someone who has written one terrible novel.
Oh yeah, but oh boy. First of all, you tell a lie about how long it took you to write it. That's the ground rule, okay? Somebody would say it took you a few years to write this, and you say yes, implying that it might be 3 or 4, but it might be 10. You know, it's a very, certainly at the beginning, for most people, it's a very slow process, because it's a drawing together of all kinds of ideas and all sorts of themes. And it's a learning process totally itself. I mean, you can do all the creative writing courses in the world, and they won't deliver a novel or anything else worthwhile, unless you have the facility in the first place to do so. And on that point, Sarah, I'd say that the creative writing courses that are certainly the one I was developing and in charge of in UCD, when they were selecting people for the course, it was based on what we felt was a facility on their part to write creatively in the first place. I mean, that's the bottom line at a fairly advanced level. Now, for me, it was a reaction, and it's, you know, to the world in which I was living. I had grown up in the Midlands in the 1950s, not like Fergal, the 80s or the 70s. And so it was a time of an incredible amount of emigration, and there were families emigrating to Britain, and the statistics are all there, and history wrote about them. I was also teaching history then from the 70s onwards, and I was amazed that there seemed to be no mention in the history books, the ones that were bringing the course up to date, about this phenomenon, and yet it was the huge phenomenon of my childhood. And I suppose that prompted a response to try and chart the experience of somebody going to England, as it were, and coming back and forward as the immigrants of that generation did. And these are very unskilled. You know, this was an emigration of poverty in search of opportunity. And I think it possibly started off as a kind of polemic of some sort. And then I realized that that wasn't a suitable style for the thing. And I started developing it into a sort of fictional narrative, giving it a particular character. And really, from there on in, you know, you force it along. Oh my goodness, with novels, they're you know, the main thing is to work, and to edit. I think most writers will tell you that. It really is 99% work and 1% inspiration.
Right.
But that's discouraging, Sarah. Sorry, no, hold a second. No, Sarah, there's some wonderful talk. You can be happy working.
It's not discouraging at all. No, it's I think that usually seems to be the case, that most things worth doing are not necessarily going to come easy the first attempt. But no, and I guess, you know, if we, you know, to those of us, and I think I'm definitely not unique in this, the kind of the aspiring would be kind of hopeful writer who's kind of not yet got there, you know, what are the kind of couple of pieces of advice that you'd have for them in terms of, you know, the key elements, or is it really refine your idea and put the work in?
I'm afraid I have to go back to the idea of work. You know, I mean, it is ultimately the ideas don't come unless you're working. I mean, you may get some stray ideas, and you may be able to pull them into the process, but really most of your best ideas come from, well, actually, when you're nearly going out of your mind trying to pin them down, and it proceeds along in that sort of very, you know, I'd say very uneasy way. Now, there are different kinds of writers who can sort of, you know, spin out a story really fast, but that's not my experience so much, and I think it's very rarely anybody's experience, certainly at the beginning stage. Sometimes you find a kind of area, you kind of find a voice, you find something that is going to work really well for you, and you can continue on that. And there are many great writers who, when they find a particular voice, are able to use it in a multiplicity of different settings and contexts. In other words, write several different novels. And I might come back to that later, because I'm thinking of people like Richard Ford. I'm thinking also of Kevin Barry. You know, these are people who have a very distinctive and highly polished voice, which works well over a lot of different terrain.
And I think, Fergal, in relation to your own work, like, you would deal with quite a number of themes that are, you know, it must be said, kind of the day and quite topical. And I guess I'd love you to talk me through your own process in terms of, first of all, how you decide on the themes that you're going to address, but then how they get turned into a piece of art in whatever medium it might be.
Well, I'll be thinking about ideas for years and boring my wife to tears with them, or boring my son to tears, or friends in the pub, and sometimes it can be 10 years before that idea finally comes together. So it'll be something that's intriguing me. I love Iceland, for example, and I've always thought the connection between Ireland and Iceland should be developed. And then I read the other day about these swans that go from Iceland to Ireland, actually in my son's geography book. And I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. Maybe you could make a film about these swans. So it'll be something like that. It'll be something that will connect to something else. In the case of the Monopoly houses I put on the Liffey, I was driving across the Liffey one night, and it was at the height of the boom, and all of that terrible, like the terrible hotels that are going up at the moment and the student accommodation. At the time, we had the first wave of cardboard apartment buildings in Dublin. And there seemed to be no rhyme or reason to these. They were just shooting up overnight. And this was bothering me, that from an architectural perspective, that the city wasn't being planned better. And that's how I transferred those thoughts into a visual thing, was by putting Monopoly houses on the Liffey. That the city had become a game for developers, rather than actually a very thought out, considered process of how do you make the city work for people from all types of backgrounds and walks of life.
And so actually, Liffey Town, the installation you're talking about there, so you did that as part of the Absolute Fringe in 2010, is that correct?
Is it? Yeah.
So I guess I'm sure it's familiar to some people on the call, but tell us a little bit more about it in practice.
Well, so I had tried to make this happen all through the Celtic Tiger for about 5 years, and I approached various institutions and museums, and nobody had any interest in it, and no calls were returned. And my friend Rasha Gowan was the director of the Fringe Festival, and she had seen another piece that I'd made about memory, and she always wanted to work with me, she said. And so she asked me, what have you got up your sleeve? And I said, well, I've got this idea about these Monopoly houses, and I've had it for about 4 years. And she was like, right, let's make it happen. And within about 2 months, it had happened. And Leon Bell was one of the producers on it, and she directed me towards a great guy called Jared Clancy, who helped me make it. And once I've got somebody on the dotted line with me, I can be very, not lazy, but sometimes things take me a long time to achieve. But once I get a phone call from you or Rasha or somebody, and they tell me that there's money to pay for this, and I've got a deadline, I can be very efficient. But without that, years can go on and nothing happens. So I need a carrot. Anyway, it happened miraculously. It was a very difficult thing to make these. They were the size of a garden shed, these houses. They were 2 meters by 1.5 meters. And they had to light up internally. And so we had timers on LED lights, and they had to be moored into place, and they had to stay with the tide. So anyway, it happened. And every night, it was on the news, and it was the first piece that I'd made that was on RTE News. And this was so exciting for me, that visual art was on the news. It was democratically connecting to the masses. And every night, it seemed like hundreds of families descended on the boardwalk and walked up and down. And the atmosphere changed. That part of the city became animated and of interest. And I've always thought the Liffey is the most beautiful part of Dublin. And I've always wanted more to be made of it. And this was my little contribution. So regardless of the theme behind it about the lack of planning, and it really was about bringing Dubliners into the city centre and just enjoying this gorgeous city that we have. And this was a hook to bring you in. And I would love if we thought more like that, if the planners and the city council thought more first about the people that live here. That should be where all the planning starts from. How do you make the city better? And
Yeah, I read a quote, I can't remember where, but I read you say somewhere that you basically refused to see the Liffey without rose-tinted glasses. And I thought there was something really beautiful about that. I see Trevor, my colleague, has just typed in, so he's obviously joined us this evening. So hello, Trevor. Trevor was just saying that he agreed that Liffey Town was really brilliant, and he was asking if you were going to use our city as the canvas for another project, what might that be? To put you totally on the spot.
That's a good question. Well, I then built this island the next year, like a Robinson Crusoe island, and I spent 10 days sitting on this island doing nothing except taking in the city in this Buddhist-like boredom, or it wasn't boring, but this trance. So I had an awful lot of time to think about it, and then I came up with this idea to build a linear park along, if we took out one lane of traffic at either side of the Liffey. And I did a TED talk for the Science Gallery about this, and there was meetings, and it never went. I'm not a pushy enough person, unfortunately. So it was a bit like the High Line in New York. It was very plagiaristic, I guess. So now I know the councillor are finally putting in bike lanes, and they have been put in along the North Quay. So that's a great step forward. But I think that there's still space to develop that Liffey, not as an art project, but as a space for people, like this good room for the river. And then, like the High Line, you have it animated with playgrounds and walking tours and speed dating for the over 80s and wacky daily social engagement. And that's what I would love to be my big work if it ever happens in 20 years' time. If somebody finally rings me, I would love that to happen.
Well, that's if you were saying you're driven well by deadlines, we can give you a fictitious one if you'd like. No, it's an amazing idea for a project, and I think our own Dublin High Line or some variation of that would be a it'd be an amazing addition to the city. So it's a lovely idea. James, I'm going to come back to you now. I know in kind of conversations that we've had over the years, you've been really wonderful in sharing stories and your own kind of personal experiences. And I know one topic that we've spoken about before together is about your late wife Caroline and her family. And I guess I would love for you to tell me a little bit about her family. And they are quite an extraordinary group.
Sure, but I'm very much taken there with Fergal's ideas about speed dating for the over 80s. Is this an actual concept he's working on, or is it incidental to the project? No, very. I mean, I think this will get state funding. Well, yeah, why not? Very good. Well, going back to your question there, Sarah, I think one of the things about storytellers is they tend to gravitate towards each other. And Caroline was a great storyteller. In fact, she understood the entire world in terms of stories. Facts were quite incidental, not just for her, but they got in the way of her concept. And this was true of her family and her mother, who was a famed short story writer, still very much famed, although she's been long since gone. Mary Lavin, she was a contributor to New Yorker for many years and many collections in many languages. But yeah, there was a rejection of, there was actually an antagonism to facts as they existed. They really thought they got terribly in the way of describing experience. That experience and the world and everything else was described much more in terms of sensation and how it impacted on everybody and what was really going on. So I must say, I was so taken by this from day one. I sort of just understood it, but I identified with it. And it's another way of understanding the world through stories. So everything was a story, and everything was even the most ordinary daily functions. Going out shopping, that became a story. Who they met, what happened, so and so, speculation, a lot of imaginative input into everyday small experiences. So there was never, ever a dull moment, as you can imagine. My children have it, actually. Our children have it to a certain extent. So you can imagine that in terms of discussing anything in the world, well, now I have to say, in all fairness to my daughter Alice, she is, and let me just see how can I put it. She's a big data analyst specializing in media, so there's a lot of facts there. So it wouldn't be correct to say, but she's still framing those facts into a narrative which is distributed. Yeah, Caroline was also a great reader. Indeed, we both were. And she then went on to become literary editor of the Irish Times for 10 years, and then died tragically in 2000, well, almost 2012. Yeah, there's a great excitement, as far as I'm concerned, around people who are shaping their perception and experience of the world in ways that are entertaining, original, lively, vital, and I think that is a form of creativity in itself. She'd also Caroline had also done a number of short stories. She didn't write fiction herself, but she was the editor of several different collections. Now, Sarah, you have to remember that it could be a bit tricky for people who don't really deal in facts. You have to learn how to read a bank balance, for example, as opposed to look at the envelope coming in the door and kind of tip it to the side with your toe. That's a very creative act, but it doesn't necessarily serve the world really well long term. I think it's something I continue to enjoy, and I've with it so many friends who are in that category of fairly divergent views of what's going on in the world, largely through humour. Um, uh, and when I see a phrase like absolute fringe, I know exactly what it means. It's pushing the thinking way beyond convergent thinking, right out as far as it will go. It's disrupting our view of the world very constructively and making everything a bit more interesting and exciting. But of course, everybody can't do that.
Mm.
That's only for very talented people like Fergal to disrupt the given and the status quo.
Yeah, that's that very much. I think is I'm kind of, my dinner table growing up would have been quite the opposite. I'm the daughter of scientists whose partner is also a scientist, so I'm coming very much from that sort of an upbringing, which is quite interesting. As the
You must have been fascinating to them, though.
It led to some interesting conversations. I remember, in my early 20s, my father turning around to me once and saying, "I thought you'd become really pretentious, but it turns out you just think differently to me." And we had a fascinating conversation about it. But anyway, it's
You may have educated him to that point, Sarah. You see, it's the other way of looking at it. You know?
He's taught me an awful lot. But anyway, it's like one thing that you said to me when we were speaking about Mary Laffan, who you mentioned there a moment ago earlier in the week, was you quoted the sentence that she said, this idea that a short story, it could be an idea that's been baking in the oven for 20 years.
Absolutely, and I'm sure Fergal will agree, so too a visual project. I mean, you know, something that he's thinking now or another creative person is thinking, I mean, it could take forever to get it, as they say, over the line. Yet she was a great believer in that. She had many metaphors and similes to describe the creative process, which I really ought to have paid more attention to. But you see, I didn't start writing creatively. I think my first novel came out the year before she died. So I had no, I mean, I might have learned an awful lot more if I'd listened, but she had this idea, for example, for the short story, which was like tracking an idea or tracking a perception, endlessly surrounding it, like you might some kind of prey for a hunter. And then she would make a very valid point, which was not in any way to injure or to kill it, but just to see how it responded in the chase and tracking it down that way. Now, you know, there were things like that I come back to very often in a way. I mean, or also her astonishment with the world was the big factor. She was astonished by when Fergal there talked about the cardboard boxes and whatever else. I mean, she would look at a building in utter bewilderment. Always able to, if you like, respond at this very, I suppose, creative, intuitive, personal level. It's all part of the writing thing.
It's fascinating to hear, and it's really, I guess, thank you for being so generous and kind of sharing a little bit.
Oh, not at all, because it's great also too that the museum will be running the literary tours, or is running. I mean, okay, at the moment things are on hold, but and it's going to surely have a much bigger presence in the city from that point of view, because so many people are interested in particularly the area in which the museum is based, or within a say mile or two of it, the literary, let's call them explorations as opposed to tours.
Yeah, we actually, they're running daily. It's Fiona or Trevor
Well
might
done.
type
Yeah.
in what time
Still.
it is. Yes, absolutely, every day of the week. So it's, if Fiona remembers, she might prompt me because my mind has gone blank. But yeah, we do the walking tours of the park that look at the literary history of the city, and it's it's a very lovely family friendly experience that it's been something that's kind of come out of the lockdown period, and quite a positive outcome, that it's been a new experience that we've created. And I guess kind of going back to this idea of experiences within the museum, Fergal, obviously we turned around to you back in, it would have been approaching 2016, when we were coming up to the centenary of the Easter Rising. And we kind of were aware that it was an event in Irish history that so many people knew about and kind of would talk quite casually about, but perhaps were not totally familiar with the nuance of the story, but maybe weren't going to admit that off the bat. And so we wanted to tell the story in a way that was quite accessible. And, you know, obviously you very incredibly did exactly that for us, and it was a show we were very proud of. Could you tell me a little bit about how you approached it and kind of what the key narratives you tried to get across were?
Well, I guess growing up again in the 70s and the 80s, through the troubles in the north of Ireland, all of that time had sort of infected the era of 1916, I guess. And I guess that history had somehow become tainted, for me at least. So I hadn't, beyond teaching it basically in primary school, I hadn't really properly engaged with that time. So it was this great opportunity to get paid, first of all, which is very important as an artist, rarely happens, to research it. So I read everything I could possibly lay my hands on. And, but most importantly, then to try to make it come alive, I would cycle off to Countess Markovich's house on Leinster Road, I think, in Rathmines. And I couldn't believe, you know, the name Countess Markovich seems like it's from 1,000 years ago, and it's not. It's relatively recent history. And I would go to James Connolly's little house in the Liberties and Pierce, where he grew up on Pierce Street, of course, and the story became alive. And I would go to all the locations, but I didn't go on like the 1916 walking tour or any of that. I'm a very stubborn person in how I learn things, and it kind of has to come from myself. So I learnt this story afresh, I guess, and tried to then do the same thing with the book and the exhibition, and divest it of the sort of nationalistic baggage which it's assumed in the past century. And I tried to tell it in a really playful, but still reverent, but it was playful. And I don't think we had anybody critical of the playful aspect, did we? I think most people I think were ready for a lighter, you know, there was more serious books and exhibitions around Dublin at the time. And then on that day, Easter Monday, I think, there was a day of celebration throughout Dublin, and the exhibition was put on little posters around Stephen's Green. And that was another way to bring a whole new audience to it. And thousands of people walked around. And but the best thing was the book. So the Lewis got behind it, and they paid for 10,000 books to be distributed for free to schools around Dublin. And I went and I did talks. And to this day, I have kids come up to me and say they love that book for whatever reason, and they will reread it in the way 10-year-olds will reread a book for some reason, God knows why. Yeah, but I really enjoyed it, especially as it wasn't, it was a real challenge, because I wouldn't have thought I would be naturally interested in making this big exhibition about the 1916 Rising.
Yeah, I think the outreach element of it was something, it was the first time that we ever managed to accomplish something like that, giving 10,000 copies of a book that we had kind of co-created to local school children. It was a very proud day, and yeah, it was an amazing show, and so thank you for what you did there. It's and I think kind of when we're talking about this idea of kind of engaging with the public and getting people to actually see your work, I want to go back and ask you about No Man's Land, the exhibition or the installation on the Liffey that we've already spoken a little bit about. What was the public reaction to that?
Well, it was very similar, I think. It was this hook, very similar to Liffey Town. People just, out of curiosity, wanted to see what this madman was doing on this stupid, perfect little desert island. Like, it was a New Yorker cartoon, really. My wife is in love with the New Yorker, and I never had any time for it because it's all print. There's no pictures, but there are cartoons. And then through being married to her, I've realized that this is the best magazine in the world. But I love the cartoons, and half of them involve a desert island. And anything that's going on in the world, somehow that narrative can be translated to a little funny occurrence on a desert island. And I guess I encapsulated all of the financial implosion and the IMF moving in. And it was located in the Docklands, which was ground zero. This is where all these bad banks had run roughshod over the country. And so there was all those themes going on, and I was dressed as a banker. But really, it was about me getting to selfishly sit on the Liffey for a week in this location that I'm obsessed by, and I think is so beautiful. And I thought, yeah, as much as the political overtones, it's about, again, drawing people down to this very beautiful natural space that we need to engage with more. And thousands of people came, and it was on the front page of, you know, the Guardian and the New York Times. So there was this international aspect to it, and not, I mean, it wasn't on the front page because of me, it was because it was used to illustrate the fact that we were going down the tubes economically, and mine was an easy an easy image to use with that. But I love that the project resonated widely, and the best public engagement was it a highly creative one. It was one night at 11 o'clock. I'm sitting there freezing my ass off, drinking vodka straight to try to keep warm. And I hear the sound of something plopping in the water, plop. And then another plop, plop, plop. And it turns out that there's about 5 teenage boys have set up a little driving range on the south side of the bank, of the riverbank, and they are pegging golf balls across to try to hit me on the island, which they don't manage to do until miraculously the cops turn up and run these guys. But I thought, this is brilliant. And one day a flotilla of boats decided to arrive and circle around me and take off again, and a seal would come and visit me sporadically. So there was all these lovely things happened. I got a message in a bottle, floated down the river with a little questionnaire, which I have somewhere still, asking me questions, which I replied to on my phone.
That's really, it's amazing. The interaction with the seal would have been quite interesting to observe, but when I was just reading about it generally, I noted that you mentioned somewhere that you'd packed a fishing rod and a camping stove. Were they used?
They were. I mean, not the fishing rod. I mean, I also packed a little, what do you call it, a little guitar, those little things.
A ukulele, is it?
A ukulele, which I thankfully, for the sake of the local residents in the cardboard apartment box, I never took out. I was expecting to be very bored, and I would have to stimulate myself, and I'd a wind-up radio, and I'd brought all these things to keep me going, but actually it had been such a palaver to make happen. And it only came together at the last moment. That night it came in, and that the peace that came with having to do nothing. I was so happy to sit there and for hours, exhausted from the work, but delighted that I'd somehow pulled it off. You know, it mightn't have worked. Like the sand wasn't really sand because it would have washed off if it rained. So it was a sandy resin. But we'd only put that on the night before, so it hadn't fully set, you know, so it was all very, you know, in the way these things are, you've only got a week to make it, and it had to get towed out from Grand Canal docks in 2 pieces because it wouldn't fit through the canal lock. So we had to, you know, that was a difficult thing. It came out in 2 pieces, and then it had to be screwed back together, this 11-meter wide, very large structure, and we had to dive down under it at about 2 in the morning and anchor it in 4 different places with twisted lines so it wouldn't move with the tide. So again, I didn't need to go fishing. I just was so delighted that I got away with it, that it had worked.
It's such a fascinating experience to hear about. It's really very amazing. But James, one thing I don't actually think I've ever asked you before. You joined our board of directors here in the museum a number of years ago, and I've never actually asked you what motivated you to get involved.
Oh, I think it's the best project out, honestly, in the city. I think it's the beating heart of the city, potentially, in a way. And when you have people like Fergal on board, can I just ask him one question?
Please.
The artifacts, the suitcase was the best thing. Fergal, where did the suitcase emerge from?
Well, the suitcase is right beside me. I'm now in my wife's office. It's strange you should ask. It is here.
Yeah.
And I gave her this as one of the first Christmas presents I think I gave her many years ago, maybe 15 years ago. So
Not every man would give his wife a suitcase as a Christmas present. You know?
That's true. Pack your bags. I don't know. She likes all the things.
Very true.
So I tried to use my own stuff in a lot of my projects. So things that have meaning. So like I built this lighthouse in the Science Gallery, a replica of the North Bank Lighthouse, that lovely green. It looks like a post box that you will see from the south wall. I built this giant replica of that you could go into and have as your own space for a half. I
thought that the suitcase was really brilliant in complicating the whole narrative. You had the banker, and then you have this kind of emigrant suitcase from the 1950s, and that the more work everybody has to do on the project, the more diverse the artifacts are, which was a wonderful sight. But back to you, Sarah, on that question there about look, it's a real privilege to be involved in the little museum. I'm fascinated by it and its success, and I would totally back up the idea. I think it was Fergal who said it earlier, that when you go in, you're really welcome. You're immediately part of the whole thing. And we've all had years of kind of even queuing for tickets from disinterested people in museums elsewhere. But this is like a breath of fresh air, and I think it's a terrific project, and that's exactly why I wanted to be part of it.
Oh, that's really lovely. It's and Fergal, a question that I'm curious more than anything. So obviously you are a primary school teacher, and we see quite a lot of narrative going on at the moment about the plans to reopen schools and kind of what the next couple of months are going to look like. And I guess I'm just curious, in your opinion, how's it all going? How are the preparations going? Or am I allowed to ask that?
Well, Fintan O'Toole, who often hits the nail on the head, wrote an article last week in the Irish Times, and he said the Department of Education it does not provide education, it provides for education. So they will provide the funds, but the actual educational aspect is very much left to teachers and schools and principals. And there's this constant reinvention of the wheel rather than this collective, I guess, drive. There's an awful lot of work that's being done in all of these schools, which is wasteful because they're all doing the same type, rather than the body from the top being more helpful, giving a really detailed curriculum. And exactly the same thing, in my opinion, is happening with the coronavirus guidelines. They're being left they're quite loose and open to interpretation. And I think they need to be an awful lot tighter. And I think we need to look at countries like Switzerland and Denmark and Taiwan, what's happening there and what's working, because they've already gone back to school. And there's not enough discussion. We no longer live in Ireland. We live in a much more global context, so we need to learn from other countries. And I think having 30 children in a small room without a bathroom, without proper ventilation, when it gets cold and the heat goes on, what's going to happen? I think we need a lot smarter people coming together and coming out with the best plan possible that's really thought through. like, I think children should be wearing masks and can take them off if they need to, but I think teachers should be wearing visors. I think the Department of Education should be putting the whole curriculum online. They should be employing teachers like they did with the homeschool hub, but actually a more detailed version of that. So if you want to keep your child at home, you can. They can learn from home, so that, you know, so you get a choice. And then children of essential workers can still go to school, children with special needs. So, you know, this hasn't happened in 100 years. This is a pandemic, which is a very serious word. And I think we've done very well up till now, and I think we've taken our foot off the pedal a little in the last few weeks, but I think it's a disaster waiting to happen. And I think we'll find that out, unfortunately, in September. I'm sorry to be so negative, but I'm not optimistic.
Okay, well, I hope it progresses in a way that ends up being better than that. But I guess, yeah, to end on a high note as opposed to a low, if museums such as ourselves, if we can be doing one positive thing to be engaging third level students or indeed primary school students, you know, can either of you think of something that we can be doing to be useful? So the little museum and our neighbouring attractions, how can we provide for our community in the months ahead?
Well, reopening fully. I mean, you know, if it were possible to see what the months ahead are going to be like, then you could come up with an idea. But really, flexibility is the biggest single factor now. Flexibility to respond quickly if things get worse. You know, unfortunately, that will save. That will be advantageous to students, secondary and primary. And I know that's not very positive, Sarah, but really, I think that kind of immediate, quick, fast action is what every institution and agency needs to kind of take on board.
Yeah, well, I think it's a small museum by our name, quite literally. That's fast reaction is something that we are capable of doing. But I think, oh wow, I've just noticed the time. Somehow we have been speaking for over an hour. It's
no bother.
Well, Fergal and James,
teachers, sorry, Sarah, teachers, you know, teachers can teach for 4 or 5 hours, you know, on the track. Okay.
I should have booked us in for a longer session. But no, I've really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and you know, thank you both to you for, first of all, for being here, but then also for being so generous with your stories and your knowledge. And I've really enjoyed it and really appreciate it. So thank you both very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and we'll see you next week. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.